Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm here again with James Ellias. I pronounced it right that time, which is great. How are you doing today, man?
I'm pretty tired. I've been working like a lunatic and I don't know how to take breaks. So
Oh yeah.
here I
That's
am.
definitely a thing. I think this morning I was actually working on some math homework, and our math teacher, like with the coronavirus and stuff, like I don't know if we're actually going to get through all our content, so I started like reading ahead, and I read like 3 or 4 chapters this morning, and I was just taking notes, and I'm like, why am I doing this? I wasn't even required to do any of this, and I would just get exhausted doing it. And then
Nice.
but hey, it is what it is. I learned about line integrals today.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Nice, nice. Did the Booker teacher give you any indication of what a line integral refers to in reality?
um well, sort of like
There's the
when
reason I'm
when you're
asking.
doing when, like, let's say something is moving in a curve, right? It's moving like around, like, let's say there's a gravitational object, right, like the Earth, for example, and you're moving in a certain line around that in a certain way, and there's like a vector field basically of what the gravitational pull is towards it. So then the line integral would basically be like how much work the gravitational field is doing on that object when it's moving along that curve. Yeah, so it's
Right.
I try to connect things to reality as much
No,
as I
that's
can,
that's
which
really
is
good.
good.
That's actually, as far as I know, that's the only application I know of a
Yeah.
line integral
Yeah, and
myself.
there's also, like, I'm sure there's like electric charge and those sort of things too. Like basically anything with
It
a
still
potential
work.
field. Yeah. Yeah, with like work. Yeah.
Potential field is just work,
Yeah.
but like stripped of one layer of abstraction. See, when I was learning that concept in calculus 3,
Mhm.
I asked the TA, what does this refer to? I didn't say it that way because I'd only been an objectivist for
Yeah.
like 2 years at that point. But I just said, like, is there? I had to word it a certain way, but I asked just what the hell does this refer to? And the TA said it's just an integral. I was
Oh
just
my
like, no,
gosh.
not just an integral. Like, I was adamant, like, no, it can't just be that.
Yeah,
And
that's terrible. There's then
he's just like,
there's no practical purpose for it in that case. Like, vector fields are things that come up in reality. There's no use for a vector field if it doesn't come up in reality, and you sometimes need to know how that field interacts with an object moving along a curve. And that's very important.
yeah. And but he was in his mathematician bubble, and he's just like, what's this physical world you speak of?
Oh yeah, no, I hate that attitude towards math. That's like the whole like Bertrand Russell approach and all those like rationalistic mathematical people that just they just disconnect math from reality, and they make it just deductions from certain axioms, and that's not the best way to do math, I would say. And it's just so disconnected from reality too, because you can't learn math that way because you don't know what the hell is going on. You can't visualize it or connect it to anything whatsoever.
Yeah. You know what's funny is like I used to give all sorts of arguments against people who think that way. And I used to get into arguments with them, but it's been so long since I've actually gotten into an argument with someone who's like that I can't even like think. I actually lost the ability to like understand where they're coming from. Um,
Oh
like
yeah,
I
that's
that's just
something I
me.
noticed. That's something I noticed with a lot of philosophical stuff. Like, if after you integrate something so clearly and you see it so clearly, it's hard to like go back and see the other side on things. Like, I noticed that very clearly with egoism and altruism. Like, when somebody's arguing from an altruistic perspective, it's like, okay, but like, how is this good for me? Why is this good for my life? And I'm like, no, wait, they don't care about, like, they view that as evil. They view this as a bad thing. I'm like, I can't. It's tough to wrap my mind around that sort of thing, because at this point it's become like so obvious that the primary goal for me should be to maximize my life and happiness.
That's interesting because, well, when I was your age, or no, actually when I was older than you, I think like especially when I was about age 22 or so, I'd been well, like, yeah, somewhere around there. I was actually really good. I made it a point to like be able to switch. I actually one time I played a game with some friends of mine at the time. I played this game where I would pretend to be a historical philosopher who held a position other than objectivism, and I would debate with them. And I'd been teaching these friends objectivism.
Yeah.
And so in one of these little fun dialogues, I pretended to be Bertrand Russell and I spoke with an English accent. I forget what I was trying to argue.
Oh,
but what I would do is like I would take on this alternate position, and one friend of mine in particular thought it was so weird because I would say everything with the confidence I would usually say it, only it was the opposite of objectivism. I'd be like arguing against cause and effect, and they'd just be like, I have trouble even recalling it now because it's been so long since I've tried to actually. I made a point of being able to shift philosophical contexts early because, well, this point is more interesting than the funny little story. But the reason I did that was because in philosophy, like what a philosophy does is it integrates everything. It integrates all of your beliefs. Mm-hmm. So like one way to test a philosophy is to try it on. At least this is what I did when I was young. Like I tried it on. I said, what would happen if I just pretended I viewed it this way? Mm-hmm. And I made a point of just like saying, okay, like I'm going to really take seriously the idea of being Hume or being Descartes, and try it on. And like, what does science look like when you attack it from these premises? What does ethics look like when you attack it from these premises? And like, it kind of helps you see the different philosophies against one another. And what it does is it helps, especially what it does, if you know objectivism is correct, if you think that you really are certain, like, okay, this matches with the facts and nothing else does. If you're confident in that, then what this can do is what this little exercise or this like way of life that I had for a few years, like is it helps you identify when you're actually being inconsistent with objectivism. Because you'll find that a lot of times even though you're not a rationalist, you'll think like a rationalist. Even if you're not an empiricist, you'll sometimes think like an empiricist. And you'll catch yourself doing this if you really know what the explicit premises are and you've taken them to their logical conclusion in thought and not in action because they're wrong, but like in thought, at least in trying to integrate.
For sure. I mean, yeah. And that also like that sort of thing can help give you confidence as well, it seems, because like if you can understand what the other philosophy is and what you're rejecting about it and like how it actually contradicts reality because you're thinking about reality in this way. And then you see like what the actual roadblocks are for that and where this directly contradicts reality. You can overcome that philosophy a lot easier. It's not as tempting. It's not as enticing as if you just rejected it based off a straw man without any real understanding, which that's also something that I try to avoid when it comes to like debating people. Like I like getting out and debating people because I want to hear arguments against objectivism in their strongest form so that I can reject those strongest arguments rather than just listen to like what Rand or Peikoff says their argument is, which they represent it well. I am 100% in debt to them for how good they can represent these arguments. But if I don't engage with them firsthand and hear them from their strongest advocates and hear how that person rationalized their position, it doesn't seem like I can refute that position as well and understand what objectivism means as well either, because of the whole thing that you said with the whole idea of like, how they think, how they come to these conclusions, and you want to avoid those methodologies when you're coming to objectivism as well.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the issue of this is one way to know whether objectivism is even right. I wonder if a lot of people, they end up ditching objectivism later because it's as philosophies go, it's a fairly popular one. Like, I mean, you can just pick up a good book and then discover this whole philosophy and you never knew there was an alternative philosophy. I bet there's a lot of people out there where objectivism is the only exposure they have to philosophy whatsoever. And they don't realize that there's alternatives. And so those alternatives actually seep in because they've never seep into their mindset, because they say like, oh, well, conservative Christians, they're basically objectivists. Like I think some objectivists will make mistakes like that because they don't have a very good contrast to draw from.
Yeah. And it's
So
at that point it's really easy to hear good things that like a conservative or a like non-objectivist would say, because there's good things that they say, there's good things that people like that come to the conclusion of, but if you don't understand like what methodology they used, what philosophy they come from, it's really hard to reject them on principle. It's easy to see superficially that conservatives, they generally believe in capitalism, although they're falling more and more away from that over time, but they generally believe in capitalism, so they're basically on our side, so let's build a big tent and bring everybody in. And
yeah. As you were saying this, a really scary thought popped into my head. And the thought was this, like, the last time conservatives were talking about capitalism, you were practically in diapers. Like, you were basically a baby back when conservatives, I'm joking, you were like 16.
Oh yeah. I got attracted to conservatism initially because I like listened to like a Steven Crowder video on socialism. That was my first. I remember like that was the moment that it all changed. That was the moment that I started caring about politics. And now like Steven Crowder, I can see how like superficial his positions are and all the problems with his positions. But back then that was like life changing. Like, yo, there's this idea of like freedom and communism is bad. I mean, all these years I've grown up and communism sounded good. I mean, like, what's the fucking phrase? Shit. Now I'm losing it. Yep, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. I'm like, that sounds like a good idea in principle. But then I heard it, and I'm like, wow, this actually, like, this is terrible. This is an immoral philosophy. And then now he couldn't actually back that up because he just went down into altruism after that. But I realized over time that I needed selfishness, and I needed Rand's philosophy, and ultimately reason and reality, and this whole great philosophy of objectivism and it all started with Steven Crowder. Thank you, Steven Crowder, for converting me to objectivism. I think I was a freshman in high school. Like, I just read 1984, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, authoritarianism is bad. I get that. And then I thought it was a critique of socialism actually the first time I read it. But George Orwell was actually like a free market socialist type guy, or not free market socialist. Sorry, libertarian socialist. There's like a dude on Instagram named like free market socialist or something like that. So now instead of thinking libertarian socialist, I think about that person sometimes, which is all right. But yeah. So I thought it was a critique of socialism. So then I like looked up socialism. Why is socialism bad? So that somewhat like on YouTube, and then the Steven Crowder video came up, and then like I was a freshman, and this was like life-changing stuff. This was stuff I never heard before.
Yeah. Huh. God. I forget how old I was when I read 1984. I want to say I was 12. It scared the crap out of me. No, I think it was like, I was either somewhere between 12 and 14. I was so scared. Like, that was the scariest thing. Like, especially the end, where it's like
spoiler alert,
brother. Yeah, spoiler alert. Sorry. Well, yeah, and that I for some reason I thought that was like possible, that they could get you to like love something just by torturing you enough.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, George Orwell apparently thought it was possible. So
and the whole 2 + 2 = 5 thing, that tripped me out. Like they're actually getting him to believe this completely contradictory to reality thing, and that just like that was a shocking moment to me. That's like the one part that I think stuck with me. The whole idea that you can get you to believe contradictions. Like, contradictions are contradictory. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
Well, you know what? I always kind of felt like objectivists did not give George Orwell enough credit. I've never heard a single objectivist to speak highly of George Orwell. But, like, think about what he did. Without Ayn Rand, although... I mean, he lived around the same time as Ayn Rand, so like he could have had access to her. I think 1984 came out around the same time as Atlas Shrugged did. I think.
No, Atlas Shrugged was the like 50s or 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah, 56, I think, and I think
Uh
1984 was 54. I
I think it was
think.
48 because it was the opposite.
Okay.
I remember. Yeah, but
Oh, is
that's
that
it's still
okay? I
yeah
thought it was supposed to be 30 years later. That would, yeah,
yeah.
okay, okay, but still, it was around the same time. Like George
Oh
Orwell would
yeah.
have been alive for like Fountainhead. Anyway, but he's still, I don't know. So maybe he doesn't deserve too much credit, but I think here's a huge thing he does. He identifies a huge epistemological foundation for totalitarianism, and that's the idea that the state can even change what's true. It's like
Oh
that's what,
yeah.
like, he makes this central. Like on the surface, I mean, think about it this way: Republicans will talk all day long validly, but this is as deep as they go. Well, if you pay everyone, no, if you pay everyone regardless of what their job is, no one's gonna work. you know like, that's about as deep as they get, and it's completely true, but it's about as deep as
Hmm.
it gets. Or if you give goods away like according to need, then no one's going to bother having any ability.
Yeah.
If your needs are fulfilled without exercising your abilities, no one's going to bother working,
Yeah,
basically.
that was actually my mom's justification against communism when I asked her when I was really little, because I like heard about it and I'm like, yo mom, communism doesn't sound very bad, but she's like, oh, nobody would work, and then that was basically the justification I thought about it. I'm like, yeah, that's true. I mean, communism must be bad then, and then I moved on. And
I had a very similar conversation with my dad. Yeah. um the way I did, I asked him, as I said, why do we have money? I said, why don't we just give people the things they need? And then he explained it, and I was just inoculated against stupid economics and politics for the rest of my life, just because of that on its own. It makes me wonder by what set of mental gymnastics people like even fall into leftism. Like, it kind of just has to be dishonesty on some level, right? Because it's like, whatever your moral beliefs are, it's like, you can't, at the end of the day, you have to, an honest leftist will just have to bite the bullet, and they'll have to say, look, I know this doesn't work economically, but God told us, or, but that's what's right, or whatever.
yeah, I
Like,
mean
you
that's
have to bite the bullet.
yeah, I mean that's ultimately how their arguments go. Like, oh, this is unfair, this is unequal, and then so we got to take from the top and give it to the low. Or Jeff Bezos doesn't pay his workers enough, so we have to make him pay them more. Or it's not right that these business owners get all the profit when it should actually go to the people on the bottom, and those sort of things. And
It kills capitalism by inches, I guess. I guess if you string together enough little positions like that, which
oh
have
yeah.
plausibility, and you're able to, like, avoid the obvious contradictions, I guess eventually you just become a socialist.
Yeah, I mean,
But
fundamentally, like, it comes from this view of economics being that there's these resources out here, and then we got to find a way to divvy them up. And well, we see in capitalism that all these rich people, all of society's wealth is getting divided towards them more. So shouldn't we try to divide it more equally? But then
yeah,
completely misunderstanding where that wealth comes from, or why that
yeah,
wealth even comes into existence.
cookie jar economics. Your mama gave you 12 cookies. How do we split them up? Well, I guess since we didn't buy the cookies, everyone should just get the same amount. So,
Oh yeah.
there was something. I mean, what scares me is, with this coronavirus thing, you don't hear anyone talking about how bad the economics of the stimulus are. Like, even Glenn Beck, I didn't watch the whole thing, so I could be missing some part of it that's important, but I saw you see Glenn Beck on Dave Rubin?
I don't watch much Dave Rubin. I mean, I've gotten over him.
Yeah, I got over him too, but
Oh yeah.
I was just drinking coffee and just
Yeah.
trying to, like,
Oh no,
start
I'm
my
not. I'm
brain.
not judging it.
Well, you should. No,
No, man.
well,
I watch Destiny, Vaush, and Nick Fuentes exclusively. So definitely
yeah.
judge me harshly.
Isn't Nick Fuentes like a fascist or something?
Oh
Or
yeah,
what is?
yeah. He's terrible. I mean, I don't know.
He's not really a fascist. He's a right wing pundit, right?
Yeah, yeah. Basically, like he's pretty much a fascist. Like he talks about
Okay.
like the Jewish question, but he dog whistles it heavily. so that like he'll dog whistle it so heavily that if you ever press him on, he's like, "Oh no, I was just talking about how Cookie Monster couldn't bake 6 million cookies in 5 years." Yeah, no, it's bad. Like he's so obvious with it, and then you just can't call him out, you know? 'Cause, yeah.
You can, he just won't fess up to. That's weird. But anyway, so Glenn Beck, he had a fairly decent statement, which was the stimulus makes sense because the government, at least like on some level, because the government asked everyone to stay at home and not do their jobs. So it's only reasonable that the government should compensate people for this damage that it did to their economic lives, basically. But what's crazy is that somehow even Glenn Beck, who, and I'm not trying to, I'm definitely not trying to give some sort of profound compliment to Glenn Beck here, but last time I heard, he was a libertarian, and libertarians tend to be very well educated in economics. And like, wait a second, Glenn, have you forgotten economics in one lesson? Like, have you forgotten that all a stimulus is just throwing a brick through every other store's window? It's basically, you might as well just drive a car down every street in America and throw a brick through every other window and say like, well, there we go. We've stimulated the economy.
Yeah, gets the money circulating. Gets those.
Yeah,
it's gonna boost the glass industry. There you go.
Yeah. Have you read that book?
I have not, but I've heard. I know that analogy, and I really want to read Economics in One Lesson because that's.
Yeah, it's a solid. It's a very solid book. Ooh, here's another one actually. Have you read The Richest Man in Babylon?
I have not. I've never even heard of that. Who's that by?
Put that ahead of Economics in One Lesson because it's about personal finance, and a lot of it's kind of obvious stuff, but some of it's not, and it kind of like it helps you conceptualize abstract things about how to make money, basically. Like he talks about there's these two men in Babylon, and they're roughly of equal intelligence. They're roughly of equal like value to society, and what I'm trying to say there is they both have jobs that are valued in society. Like one is a chariot maker, and then the other, I forget what the other one is, but one of them's incredibly wealthy and the other one is just barely making ends meet. And the entire reason one is the richest man in Babylon and the other one's busting his ass and not getting ahead is because one knows how to manage money and the other one doesn't, basically. And it goes through all these details of like, and the difference it makes. Like, okay, like one of the rules is 10% of all you make is yours to keep. And he's trying to say, save 10% at least, basically. And then he starts with that. And then all these other rules sort of follow, like invest your wealth in things that you understand, put your gold to work for you. So it can make money while you sleep. So it's a really big book for me early on in life.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've always wanted to get into like investing into things, but I don't know like anything about it or what to invest in or like what sort. I also have to pay for college too, which is a whole nother story. But we'll see. I think I should be fine for the next year. I haven't taken out a loan yet, which is really nice. I'm one of the lucky ones. I got a big scholarship for my college, and then now I don't have to take out that many loans, and I can save a lot more of my money. And with the Corona thing, they refunded like all of our room and board, or just like the what was left basically. I think it was probably like 60% of what was left or something like that. So I got like an extra cushion, but I haven't been saving it as much as I wanted to. I've been buying a bunch of books basically.
Well, never skimp on books.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
If these are books, if these are books so you can, see them on your shelf and go, then that's one thing. Don't buy those. But if you're reading them, they're worth it.
Yeah. I think I have a problem with buying way too many books though, because I have like, if you've seen my shelf, it's full, but I read like 10 pages a day, and I'm not getting through those books for at least a couple of years. So, but we'll see someday.
My policy is books on average, books are cheap in comparison to the benefit you gain from them. So at least for me, I just buy it. I have quite a few books I haven't read yet, or like a lot of books I've read like a couple pages of. But there's always a reason I stop. It's never, it's a lot of times like you feel like, oh, I got to finish this whole book. It's not always the case. Sometimes like the reason that you're feeling like you aren't interested is because there's nothing more for you to gain from the book. Sure. There's no rule that says you got to finish every book that you read. I kind of treat books like a Marine treats bullets. Like it's just fuel for the fire. It's just ammunition. It's just more like a lot of people like, they're like, oh, like look at all these like beautiful books. Like, oh, it's like, this is, I don't know. For me, this is fuel. This is ammo. Like, yeah, it's kind of their, I have a different attitude towards them. I think it's like, I just have them on my shelf ready. Like, oh wait, what was that one thing I remember? And then I take it off the shelf and like, okay, yeah, that. Okay. They're just there for me to use later. Like,
yeah, for sure.
Sort of thing. Yeah, it's almost like not sentimental to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed with like I used to not read as much as I would like to, and I would go weeks, months without reading, and I would like, oh, then now I'm gonna read like 200 pages today, and then I'd get through like I'd finish Atlas Shrugged. That's basically how I finished Atlas Shrugged. I had it on the shelf, and I would do like these. I would binge read basically. I'd read like 200 pages and then put it down. 200 pages, put it down. 200 pages, put it down. And then I guess now and then this new year I got into a habit of trying to read like 10 pages a day, and I've started to struggle with that, but now I'm starting to like read a lot more analytically where I'm like underlining things in the book, and that's actually helped quite a bit. Like it makes it a lot more manageable because then I'm like I'm not just like skimming the words and trying to comprehend it. I'm like searching. It feels like I'm searching for good quotes or searching for the essential. And that's like that. It's a lot more goal directed, and it's a lot more, it feels a lot more focused, and it's a lot easier to get through, I think.
Now, why read 10 pages a day? Why set a goal of reading a certain amount?
Just so that I can like actually do it, so that I'm not just like setting the book down for months and then like waiting 2 months to read, do that whole like binge reading thing still, so that I can just get in the habit of getting through books. And I mean that's valuable because I want to read more books. And when like I feel like I've just noticed that when I read a book, it gives me so much more knowledge than like watching a bunch of YouTube videos or courses on the same subject. So like after I read ITOE, like I noticed my ability to talk about epistemology greatly improved. It improved drastically. And even just like I just started Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, but I feel like so much clearer on political issues just from like the first couple pages of those essays.
Right. Something I'm realizing is that my needs are very, very unusual and very, very specific. Like I have a research project. That's what you're trying to learn. You're trying to just grow your mind generally. Whereas like I'm settled into a track and just have a mission. That's why I don't think I really explained that. That's why I treat books like ammunition. Like I have a certain, I'm not just learning kind of in every direction anymore. Like I'm on a specific mission. And so the books for me are no longer this growth process. Like they are that, but mainly they are a resource towards a specific goal. And when I read, there's always a specific goal in mind. I'm never just kind of reading just to read. It's always it's always with a specific, I need to know this now for this purpose to get to like advance my project forward. There's nothing wrong with the other way of doing it where you just are learning just to grow as a person. There's nothing wrong. It's just not what I'm doing.
I guess part of it for me is just learning like I'll open a book and I'll think, oh, this has a good philosophical principle or a good general philosophy or like an interesting way of thinking, because I don't only read objectivist books. Like I want to read a bunch of other stuff that I find might be influential or might be interesting to learn about, just to see like how different people think about things and how different philosophers come to certain ideas. and compare that to my methodology and compare that to Rand's methodology ultimately as that standard, because that's the one that I found through my introspection and through my looking for different philosophers. I found her methodology to be the best, and now I want to sort of refine that and see how it compares to other philosophers and see how, like, where I can go wrong or those sort of things as well. So I guess that's sort of my goal going into books, is to see essential principles and philosophical methods of thinking.
You know what you might consider doing? I mean, at some point, is going through the history of philosophy.
Yeah, I listened to like some of Peikoff's courses, but I think I don't know why I stopped. I think I was listening to them at the end of my senior year in high school, and I would because I would have like a study hall every morning, and I would just sit in there and just listen to those lectures. And then,
dude, I wish I was listening to Leonard Peikoff's History of Philosophy when I was 18.
Yeah, and then after that study hall, like after the study hall thing got done, then I just stopped with that course. I should probably get back on that. I don't listen to that many courses,
it really depends on your
sucks.
needs. Just but based on what you were saying, I was just thinking that might help you.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
Ultimately, yeah. I mean, I don't exactly see you slacking off, so like, it's just a suggestion. Yeah, use your own judgment, but that course made a huge difference to me. Like, that course is what got me into the ability to sort of shift perspectives. Because every time we went through another philosopher, I really asked, what did I ask? It was a very particular question. I imagined what it would be like to be that person who, and then what would you have to think in order to integrate the world in the way this person did? That was really the question I kept asking every single time. And like every single time with every philosopher, up until everyone after Kant, I even understood how it would, like, what it would be like to integrate the way Kant did. Or on some level I did anyway. But I was able to say, like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I could see why they would do that. Like, I could see how they'd do that. Like, I can see, why you'd integrate the world that way.
Yeah, that's an
there's kind of a reason they were trying to answer certain questions, and we have some. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, I think I cut out for a moment. Yeah, they were trying to answer certain questions, and that really do come up in life, and seeing the whole range of answers really helped, like I was saying before. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the times when I hear about the philosophers presented in that course, or when I heard about them, I would think, oh, Leibniz, he believes in like monads, and what does that even mean? And just dismiss immediately. And maybe that might not be the best approach to that.
I don't remember thinking that made sense. that everything's a monad. Well, actually no, I do remember thinking that made sense, because he was on this. He had a rationalist epistemology, and he was hungry for knowledge, and so he just deduced his way. He just followed these rationalist deductions, and he says, and I could really imagine what that would be like. He says, okay, this is how you figure things out. Reasons how you figure things out. Let's do this, baby. And you just start making deductions, and then, like, okay, well, everything's made out of ensouled atoms. That's weird, but that's what the reason tells us, so that's what you got to go with.
Oh, yeah. It feels like in some of these contexts you can just rationalize just about anything you possibly want to, just by like conflating things that feel similar, or like saying, oh, I use the word the here instead of an, and what does that mean? What is the difference between the and an? Well, just fucking use and then if you're so confused about it. Like, good lord, it's the same thing. But yeah, it's like just this. Yeah, you can do all sorts of crazy shit or crazy stuff with rationalization. You got to tone down the vulgarity. I apologize.
What's that?
I got to tone down the vulgarity.
Yeah. Charles, the ghost of Charles will come and get you. So we were going to talk about Zeno's paradox. Did you want to try and talk about that? We'll see if my brain can handle it right now. Do you want to test and see if my brain is warmed up now?
Oh yeah, let's jump into it. So yeah, I mean, a basic summary of Zeno's paradox, or there's a bunch of different ones, or there's two that I've heard of. There's the whole idea of there's two distances, half, half, half. That's the one that I presented in my video on it. But the one that Pat Corvini uses is the idea of Achilles starts, and then there's a tortoise that he's chasing. Well, the tortoise doesn't move as fast as Achilles does. So then Achilles has the time to get to here, but by the time he gets there, well, the tortoise has already moved a little bit. And then he keeps doing that, and the tortoise has already moved, and he can never actually catch the tortoise, according to the paradox. And basically, Pat Corvini lays out a syllogism for it, which I actually have written down because I wrote it down so that we could so that I could plan out that.
Actually, before you deliver Corvini's, this would be really interesting. Before you deliver Corvini's syllogism, though, let's really make this paradox clear for the audience, because
yeah, for sure,
it's not. Well,
the syllogism is just I was going to use that to sort of clarify what the reasoning.
Oh, to clarify the paradox, it's not her solution. It's her.
No, just the yeah. So the first premise is obviously Achilles must complete an infinite number of divisions, or she uses divisions as distances traveled. So this would be a division, and and then premise 2 would just be Achilles cannot complete an infinite number of divisions, and therefore he cannot catch the tortoise, because he would have to complete an infinite number of steps in this, and he can't do that. So how can he catch the tortoise? And
that's definitely a solid thing to essentialize. Let's make sure the audience can understand the paradox itself, though. So the idea is, this is something the philosopher Zeno came up with, because Zeno didn't think motion was possible. He had particular philosophical reasons for thinking motion was impossible, but we won't go into that. And so here's one of his arguments against motion.
Zeno said there's no such thing as change. He got wrecked. Wait, shit.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah,
but we know that he invented the debate, or dialectic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I almost have that whole song memorized. So I still listen to that song.
It's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, okay, so Zeno, so here's his argument against motion. He says, imagine the fastest man in the world, Achilles, is in a race against a tortoise, and the tortoise gets a head start. Okay.
Yep.
In order to catch up with the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the starting position of the tortoise.
Yep.
But by the time he does so, the tortoise has moved on. The tortoise is, maybe if the tortoise got maybe 100-meter head start, by the time Achilles gets there, maybe the tortoise has gone 2 meters, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Achilles has 2 more meters to go. Okay, fine. So Achilles crosses the 2 meters. But by the time Achilles has crossed the 2 meters, the tortoise has crossed about 4 centimeters, maybe. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, whatever. Achilles can just go the next 4 centimeters. Okay, but during that time, the tortoise moved on again, maybe 8. I don't know. I'm losing track, but some small amount of distance. So the idea is every time Achilles catches up, there's still a little bit more to go. So Achilles can never catch the tortoise. And so, okay, so now read the syllogism. This is now that you have that image in your head, dear audience, think about this syllogism, and you could see where Zeno is trying to attack the idea that motion is possible at all.
Yeah, and basically the first premise would be Achilles cannot must complete an infinite number of divisions or steps to catch the tortoise. Premise 2, Achilles cannot complete an infinite number of divisions. Conclusion, Achilles cannot catch the tortoise. And I think Zeno's ultimate goal was this, the questions that they were talking about one of the big questions they were talking about in ancient Greece was this idea of multiplicity. How can you have a multitude of things that are changing and doing all these sort of things when the universe is this one big thing, sort of.
Yeah.
And that his idea was oh no, there's no multiplicity, there's no change, there's none of this. The universe is just this solid block of just pure oneness. And and this was an attempt to justify it, and it was sort of he would he was basically saying that your means of perception, you perceive the world wrong, you see multiplicity as an illusion, but real reality is just this block of oneness, basically.
Yeah. So this is going to sound a little crazy, and this is sort of a teaser to my audience, but I think I suspect that there's a sense in which Zeno and Parmenides are correct about this, that the universe is that like, I think they're noticing something. Like, here's what it is like, I think Parmenides says change can't happen. Zeno was defending Parmenides' position. Parmenides was the first guy to say, like, I think the universe is just one giant slab of undifferentiated matter. It's just a block, like, as you said. So one thing Zeno said there can't be, or rather Parmenides said there can't be change, because he says change involves a contradiction. You can't have something just change into something else. That's true. I think that's true. You can't just have something become what it isn't. What you can have is the real but Democritus figured out how, but that doesn't mean you can't have change. I'm not pro.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Change happens. What Democritus showed, Democritus had a hypothesis that everything's made of atoms, and that the atoms don't change because the atoms are what they are. They can't just become what they aren't. But the atoms rearrange themselves. So I think the general premise to draw from this is just a hypothesis that I'm playing with as I'm working on physics on the highest levels, or like when I think about what happens after relativity, after quantum mechanics, as I think about certain ways to integrate these fields in a rational way. One of the things we have to think about is this metaphysical fact that if something changes, this is just a hypothesis. If something changes, it means its constituents are changing their relationships with respect to one another. The ultimate constituents can't change because they are what they are. I think Parmenides was getting that right.
Yeah, but they go too far though when they say, like, because they also had this assumption that things can't move and can't change in relation to one another based on because if it moves here, that would imply that there was nothing here before, or something like that. Yeah. Which that's a step obviously too far.
Well, so this is something else. Like so I think Parmenides was onto something here. He took it too far, or the way I would put it, I know this sounds kind of wacky. I have to emphasize this is a hypothesis, or this is just it's not even a hypothesis. It's like a fruitful metaphysical idea that might help us in physics at some point. So here's why Parmenides and then Zeno as a result thought that there wasn't motion. So he says, okay, there is no nothing.
Yep.
Nothing is not a thing. So imagine if you're at the North Pole and then you go up, 10,000 miles. You might ask, what's there? What's at that location? You might say, well, nothing's at that location. Well, wait a second, buddy. Nothing ain't a thing. Nothing is not a thing that exists.
Yep.
There is no nothing. There has to be something there. There has to be something there, says Parmenides. I think he's right. I think I think that's right. Okay, so Parmenides says there's something everywhere. There has to be something everywhere. If there wasn't something there, it wouldn't be aware. It wouldn't be a thing. So it's just everything is something. Everything that is something. So Parmenides says from this, the world therefore has to be solidly packed. As a result, nothing can move, because everything's just locked in place. And as you were saying, like, if something moves, what is it moving into? Well, there's just more stuff here. So, it can't actually move. So things can't move.
Yeah, but like we certainly see them move, and it seems that they're like sliding next to each other and stuff. Like,
what about sliding into each other,
or just like sliding by each other? Those sort of things, like.
But what allows them to, maybe they're elastic, is what you're saying. Who said maybe all the objects are elastic? The thing is this doesn't make sense. Like, I'm not saying that this is an act. I think the thing he's getting right is that there is no nothing.
Yep. for sure.
As a result, everywhere has to have something in it.
Yeah, but then obviously not everything is solid, of course. Like things can move past each
Yeah,
other.
well, here's the thing. I think it's silly to speculate about how it is the case that everything is something,
yeah,
yet
for
motion
sure.
is possible. You don't have to stipulate that, like air is squishy and therefore you can kind of like squeeze past it or something.
Yeah.
This is all physical speculation that requires actual physical experiments, which like Parmenides didn't have the right to like say anything about because he didn't have the information.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
on the sheerly metaphysical level, I think this tells us something in physics that like there is something everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
So like, anyway, so that's what got this whole thing started for how there wasn't any motion. So Zeno is trying to defend Parmenides there. So anyway, where were we on Zeno? And his paradox. Motion's impossible.
We laid out the premises basically, and we were just explaining like what his ultimate goal was to basically argue against multiplicity and change and those sort of things.
Yeah. Do you happen to remember why he was against multiplicity?
Because everything is one. Like there's no separation between anything, so everything is just one thing.
Because, well, what was his argument for saying that everything is one thing?
Because if it's all tightly packed together, it's all just one thing. Like everything is just glued together. Everything is one entity in that context.
Why can't it just be a bunch of different entities glued together?
I don't know.
Parmenides was smarter than that. Like he had to have had an argument against that.
I'm sure he did. I'm not a Parmenidean scholar.
Right. Anyway, that's something I'd want to know because like. Anyway, let's go on with Zeno's paradox. I'm starting to think about all of these things that I kind of have cooking, but they're not done yet. Don't take them out of the oven.
Yeah, for sure. Well then, I guess we can go into like each of the premises and how to debunk them. But I mean, historically, basically Pagoravini argues, like historically, the thing that people got wrong is they would reject just one of the premises without rejecting the other. That was the thing that she would talk about. So some people would say, so Achilles must complete an infinite number of divisions to catch the tortoise. Well, some people would reject that first premise and say, no, Achilles doesn't have to complete an infinite number of divisions to catch the tortoise. So then premise 2 doesn't matter because, yeah, of course Achilles can't complete an infinite number of divisions. So then the conclusion is absurd. Achilles obviously can catch the tortoise now. Well, then other philosophers would basically reject the second premise while adhering to the first, basically. So they're like, oh, Achilles can complete an infinite number of divisions, and he does have to, but he can do it, so it's fine. And then, hence the conclusion is false.
Yeah. So yeah, those are the two ways people have historically argued against Zeno's paradox. Now, what's interesting about Zeno's paradox is not whether motion. No one's actually entertaining the idea that motion is impossible. Well, I mean, probably some a-holes are, but like skeptics out there are. But like the idea is that if whenever you come across something in any realm that doesn't seem to integrate, it mean that it doesn't. Your ideas don't seem to fit together. Like this idea of motion and this idea of subdividing distances. Like if you come across a contradiction, it means there's something to be learned from sorting out the contradiction, even if the contradiction isn't something that seems like it needs to be sorted out. Like, I have no problem going on a bike ride tomorrow morning, if I don't have Zeno's paradox solved. I'm like, oh, I would go outside and ride my bike, but I can't move. So, that's not what's going to happen. The thing that makes this interesting, it's sort of like you had a discussion with Dan Norton and you were talking about, is life, what was it? Is the standard, or hold on, is the choice to live arbitrary or not?
Yep.
That question is interesting to me, not because like, if I don't have an answer, I'm just going to sit here and not value my life. Like, oh, it's arbitrary, so I guess I won't value my life. Mm-hmm. What's interesting about it is like, it's a little hiccup in your knowledge. It's like, like, it seems like we don't have an answer to this. Like, is it really arbitrary? Like, is that really, I don't think it is, by the way. Or
I don't think it is either.
Arbitrary is not the right word to apply to the situation.
Yeah, for sure.
But anyways, this is what makes these things interesting is like you see a little contradiction in your knowledge state, and it means that if you sort it out, you'll learn something, probably on a very deep level too. So anyway, how would people, in what specific way would people deny the first premise that Achilles must complete an infinite number of divisions? What sort of specific argument would people levy to that effect?
I don't.
I can one. I don't know if it's
imagine.
actual.
I can imagine the type of arguments that people would make. I guess they would sort of have to. I mean, they would sort of have to argue that, like, it just gets like so small that it doesn't matter anymore. Basically, that's. I mean, that's similar to the sort of argument that Corvini makes in the physical context. So when you focus on it in the physical context, like, you understand that it gets to this point where, like, it gets so small of a separation that it just is indistinguishable at that point, and he can pass him.
Right. I mean, I'll tell you, there is one, I think this is Steve Patterson's view, by the way. You ever heard of Steve Patterson?
I recognize the name, but I don't recognize. I can't put a face or anything to that name.
He's another YouTube philosopher. He's about my age, maybe a little older. And he goes after Zeno. He's a rationalist. He also, I don't respect him that much because he doesn't think Rand is very important. Yet he writes a book which is completely redundant when compared against the first couple pages of Opar. Like he writes this whole book about the axiom of identity. Anyway, I'm not going to go into Steve Patterson. I'm totally drifting because I'm so tired. So, Steve Patterson basically says, Achilles, clearly motion is possible. As a result, it must be the case that Achilles is not actually completing an infinite number of divisions. So it must be the case that space is quantized. Space is discrete. Space comes in chunks. Like, you can, like, let's say you zoom in a bunch. And so it's like you can go, let's just say let's think about a billionth of a meter. You can go a billionth of a meter, but you can't go half of a billionth of a meter. You can go a billionth of a meter or not go at all.
Yeah.
If space was like if the unit of space was a billionth of a meter or whatever it was, that's what Steve is saying. He's saying it's gotta, like, space has to be discrete in this way. And Zeno's paradox shows us that space has to be discrete. That's one way that people deal with Zeno's paradox, is they say, hey, it actually teaches us that space has to be discrete. And people who think this are actually against the use of infinity in mathematics. Because they'll say, they'll say like the square root of 2, it goes on forever, right? Like, there's an infinite number of divisions implied by the square root of 2 because you can keep the decimals going. Maybe I should explain what that means. I'll explain what that means later. So as a result, they're against infinities in mathematics. And there was this mathematician I liked. You ever heard of Norman Wildberger?
Nope.
He's a cool mathematician. I mean, he's wrong about everything he's original on. Like, he's against infinities. But I like him because he's adamant about it. He says, hey, infinity doesn't make sense. People just keep using it blindly without thinking about it as though it does. Stop using infinity, guys. And he's trying to come up with all these, like, a reformulation of mathematics without infinities, including trigonometry.
How can you do calculus with that?
You got me there. Yeah. I'm working on a way of, no, I'm not gonna go into that.
Yeah, and then the second type of person, I guess, it's just the idea that, like, they can complete an infinite number of divisions. Like, they do ultimately do that. I don't know.
I mean, that would be sort of a Cantorian approach, where it's like infinity if infinity exists, you just bite the bullet and you just say, hey, infinity exists. Is that what they do?
Yeah, and it sort of implies that it exists in the real world as well, which is obviously not true.
Yeah, well,
it sort of is a, like, as Corvini describes it, it's sort of a conflation of the abstract with the concrete. Like, you conflate this abstract this abstract idea of what infinity is with this concrete scenario. But I guess we should kind of explain how she solves the paradox before we get into like how she specifically defines it.
Defines what?
Or how she explains like what the paradox is, or why people make that mistake.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk. So you've got people who solve the problem by saying that space is discretized, that space comes in chunks, and so, but then you run into this Norman Wildberger situation / Steve Patterson situation where you don't want infinity in mathematics. You reject the idea of an irrational number, for example, that has an infinite decimal expansion. You're against pi, apparently, because pi goes on an infinite number of places. So like, and then apparently you reject calculus, or you have to like radically reformat it because calculus, treats some finite quantity as being split into an infinite number of pieces. So what the hell? And then on the other hand, you have an apparently equally irrational, or like, I don't know, that sounds pretty rational to me. That sounds pretty rational in comparison to the alternative where you have actual infinities, where you just say like, yeah, hell yeah, he completes an infinite number of divisions. What of it? Infinity's a real thing. Like, I mean, that sounds like a disaster to me. So,
for sure.
So how does Corvini? So I don't know if Corvini presents the dichotomy that way. I don't remember what she says. I don't want to misrepresent her.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially like I just sort of explained like the principles. I don't know if she represents it in those sort of concrete forms, but I think those are good concrete examples of those formulations of rejecting it. And ultimately what Corvini does is she says that basically like the first approach where you reject the first premise, that's true in the physical case. When you look at what the physical race actually is, it is the first premise is false. The idea that that Achilles needs to complete an infinite number of divisions. And her explanation for this is basically that, like, let's imagine that it's a sand track, for example. That's the example that she gives, and so
this is Corvini's solution you're telling us right now.
Yeah, to the physical example, and then she later does the mathematical, or for the mathematical abstraction, where she basically what was it? No wait, I'm getting it backwards. I'm getting it backwards. For the first. Wait, hold up. No, okay, yeah. The mathematical abstraction one is the second premise. She rejects that one she says that Achilles can complete an infinite number of divisions in a mathematical abstract sense, not in the physical world sense. And the problem comes when you conflate the two and create this paradox. So,
okay, that sounds right to me. See, what's funny is I'm too tired to remember exactly what her solution is. It's been years since I focused on this, unfortunately. But we'll see if this anyway. So this is let's see if you can teach it to me right now. How about that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Pat Corvini's solution. That sounded right, what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's do it. So, I mean, basically the idea is, let's say they're racing on a sand track, for example, like Achilles versus the tortoise. When Achilles, eventually there's going to be a point where, well, basically Achilles will catch the tortoise the first time. The tortoise will move on. Achilles tortoise moves on. And eventually there becomes a point, like let's say you're measuring the distance between the two by sticking pins in the sand track, measuring the distance between them. And after each interval, after each like motion, you stick new pins in. And eventually there's going to get to a point where it becomes so small that you have to choose one side of an individual grain of sand to place the pin on. And at that point, the pins will be at the exact same point. They will be indistinguishable from each other.
Or one would be ahead of the other. You'd have to choose.
Oh yeah, for sure. But eventually you'd have to get to a point where they're at the exact same spot.
Yeah.
And now, like, you could ask, like, oh, but what if you like have a super zoomed in camera? Like, you could still see, even in that example, that the tortoise is like the last inch of its nail is hanging over. Well, then you keep going, and eventually that's camera. It has a limit to its to the precision with which it can measure it. And there will always be that limit. So every single physical example, there's going to be a point where the difference between the two is indistinguishable. And that's the point where we say that Achilles has caught the tortoise in the physical example. Because there is no difference, there's no distinguishable difference between the position of the tortoise and Achilles. And now, my initial thought when I heard this was, is this conflating? Wait, this sounds like it's conflating metaphysics and epistemology here.
So before we go there, that's a really important point. So maybe write that down so that we come to that. Yeah. But I want to make sure the audience is going to understand this.
For sure.
Because this whole idea of like, is Corvini conflating the metaphysical and the epistemological? Like, I think that's really important to understand what it is she's saying. Mm-hmm. So let's make sure. So let's imagine at each interval, like when Achilles catches the tortoise's original position, you put a pin right there at Achilles' position, and you put a pin at the tortoise's position. Mm-hmm. Then you let Achilles run up to the next pin, the tortoise pin, and you put a new pin in for the tortoise's new location. Mm-hmm. Then eventually then you keep repeating this, and the pins will keep getting closer together as you do this. But eventually you won't be able to actually put one pin out ahead of the other, because in order to do that, you'd have to stab your pin into the center of a grain of sand, which you can't do. Yeah. So what Corvini is trying to say with this grain of sand thing is she's saying that these pins are a system of measurement. There's a particular standard of measurement. And by that standard of measurement, you cannot differentiate distances any finer than a grain of sand. And then what you're saying, Garrett, is that eventually, maybe you use a camera, because, maybe the tortoise is still half a grain of sand out ahead of Achilles at a certain point in the race. So, now you just use a camera to figure out whose nose is ahead of whose,
Yep.
But then at some point you're going to run into the width of the individual wavelengths of light that's coming from the tip of the tortoise's nose and the tip of Achilles' nose.
Yep.
You won't be able to tell within that measurement, like exactness. So now why did you think that what made you think this was equating the metaphysical and the epistemological here?
I guess initially when I heard this, I thought, well, like, still metaphysically, regardless of how we can measure it, Achilles is still behind the tortoise in all these examples. Even this infinitesimal distance, Achilles would still be behind. But then, I guess the whole process of dividing distances up is something that is entirely invented through epistemology. It's entirely invented by man, by a human being, to see the distance between the two, to distinguish the distance between the two. The metaphysics just is what it is. Achilles is where he is. The tortoise is where he is. The track is what it is. The distance between the two is impossible without epistemology, without a method of measurement. And that method of measurement will always have some resolution limit.
Isn't the distance between the two racers, doesn't that have an identity? Isn't that what it is? That's a metaphysical, like the degree to which, the tortoise is beating Achilles still. That's a metaphysical fact.
Sure, but
so that's not you were saying that distance is epistemological, but
or the measurement of that distance, the ability to distinguish the distance between the two. It's not.
Yeah. Now, why does that matter though?
Because that's the whole point of what we're doing here. We're trying to distinguish the distance between the two people. Or between Achilles and the tortoise. That's the whole point of what we're doing in that instance, is distinguishing the distance between the two of them.
So I'm going to be devil's advocate here. We'll see if we really understand, Corvini's position here, or find out if it's even right.
Yeah. And another interesting thing that I've thought about with relating this, like there's two measurements that are sort of going on here. There's obviously the measurement of distance that we're actually measuring, and there's that measurement of time as well. And we know that the human eye, like, we can only perceive a certain amount of time in that perspective. And we see that as like they're getting closer and closer, the actual time interval that it takes for them to move is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. And eventually, like, the next movement, all these smaller distances will be so small, and the sum of what the rest of it would be all the way to infinity, the sum of all those times would be so small that we can't even see it. It'd just be split second and it'd be done.
The reason this gets brought up is to ensure against the process taking an infinite amount of time.
Yep.
So one argument against one argument that you could put on Zeno's side is you're like, oh yeah, absolutely, motion is impossible because it would take Achilles an infinite amount of time to complete an infinite number of actions. Achilles has to cross an infinite number of distances. Wouldn't that take literally forever? Mm-hmm. But then Aristotle says no, because each action takes half the amount, or like, some fraction of the amount of time the previous action does. So like that part of the paradox gets solved pretty easily. Well, I don't know. It's easy once Aristotle said it. So however easy that is, so that we know the solution to that part. So it's not a problem because of that. So it doesn't take an infinite amount of time. The question is how do you do an infinite number of things? But I think what Corvini is saying is it's not actually an infinite number of things. The only thing that makes it, the only reason it looks like an infinite number of things
is because we're dividing it in an infinite way.
Is because you could conceive of dividing it as many times as you'd like. You can't divide it in an infinite number of, you can't actually divide it an infinite number of times. You may divide it as many times as you'd like. You can't divide it an infinite number of times. And that's kind of her point. She's saying that, like, considering the divisions, when you consider the number of divisions, you will always consider some number of divisions. Yep. You will always be using some standard with some finite amount of resolution.
Yep.
And once you do that, there will be a moment where Achilles is behind the tortoise one moment and he's in front of the tortoise the next moment, because you picked some sort of chunk. You picked some sort of division. You picked some sort of chunk. He's behind the tortoise one moment and then he's ahead. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And that's now you could say, oh, but we could divide again. And then there's a bunch of gradations of when he's behind and when okay, yeah. But then once you pick that smaller division, there will be a division at which he's behind, and then the next division he's ahead.
Yep.
And that's all there is to it.
In every particular case, there is a limit. And you can abstract away and say that, oh, but you can always pick a different one, and you can always there's no actual limit to, or there's no like inherent limit to that to the amount of precision that you can have on that distance. But in every particular case, there is one. There is a limit. And if you're familiar with Rand's theory of concepts, I think this is starting to like ring some bells in your head, because the whole idea of like a point that Rand makes a lot in her theory of concepts is like, when you have a measurement, or when you have a particular thing, it has measurements, but the abstraction, all the measurements are omitted. In reality, it must have a particular measurement, but in the conceptual form, it's just the measurements are omitted. So the same theory of concepts applies to this process, to this infinite division process. Or I shouldn't say infinite yet, because we haven't defined that, but this is how you define an infinite process.
It's not an infinite number of divisions, it's some but any divisions.
Yep.
It's some size of division, but it can be any size of division.
Yep. And then basically when we form this concept of this type of division, sequence of divisions, we omit the measurement of our measurement, basically, of our measurement method. I like that phrase. So I wanted to get it in here.
Yeah. I was making sure you got to say that.
Yeah.
I saw you write it down on our notes before.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Say it again. I'm sorry. I ruined it for you.
Yeah, so you have to omit the measurements of the specific way of measuring things, omit a measurement of a measurement. So there's a specific measurement of your method of measurement, which is basically like your camera, for example. There's a certain limit to its resolution. With the pins in the sand, there's a certain limit to the resolution of those things, of that form of measurement as well. So there's all these different forms, or there's all these different what are they called? Resolution limits. And when you form the concept of measuring these sort of things and forming this infinite divisibility sort of sequence, you omit that measurement. You omit the measurement of the resolution limit. And then you have this sort of open-ended resolution limit, which is where you ultimately can get the concept of infinity from later, because making an infinite number of divisions in this context would mean that there's some particular limit in any given case, but in general, it's unlimited. There's no limit to the mathematical abstraction. It's unlimited, infinite, basically.
Right. So yeah. Now here's the next thing. So like, I understood that at one point during like maybe my second listen of this lecture. I had to listen to this lecture like 3 or 4 times. By the way, the lecture we're talking about, we should link this. It's Achilles, the Tortoise, and the Objectivity of Mathematics by Pat Corvini. Mm-hmm. So in like, I understood this by maybe the second listen, but what I didn't understand is this huge question for me. I said in effect, how does this solve the problem? Because there's like, metaphysically speaking, there's still an infinite number of divisions. Like, she's talking about a measurement process, and I get it. Like, your measurement process has to be some particular unit. Your measurement process has to have some chosen division. But isn't it the case, or might it be the case, that any particular distance is divisible in principle an infinite number of times? Aren't there, in fact, an infinite number of considerable distances between Achilles and the tortoise at any one moment? It doesn't seem. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't seem like she's solving the problem here.
It is true that it is possible to divide them infinitely, but you can't. Like, that's not something that you can actually do. Like, this process of coming up with this process of coming up with an infinite number of divisions between these things is something that we completely construct in our mind. Like, it's something that we completely construct to create these divisions between these things for the purpose of measurement. They're like, these divisions, this way of dividing things doesn't actually exist apart from a human form of measurement on it. Like, there's no actual infinite number of divisions here. Like, you can divide the distance an infinite number of times, but all that exists is that distance and the relation between, which is just the relation between the two. There's no inherent division in that distance.
Yeah. That's the answer to my question. Yeah, that does it. Yeah, because like, dividing is something we do. It's not a thing that exists out there. So it's like, it's valid to ask the question, like, is there a smallest unit of space? Like, maybe there is. I mean, maybe there is. Maybe it's like you maybe at some point, if you zoom in enough, you find that you can, like, it's sort of like a chessboard geometry at the very bottom level. Like, you can move, you can move a millionth of an inch, but you can't move half a millionth of an inch.
Yeah. But even like,
we don't have the answer to that question.
Yeah. And even if there was, that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, because you can still, like, perceive a distance between the two. Like, you could, like, I don't know how specifically that would work.
To perceive it if they're really, I think the problem,
you could, like, you can conceptually still divide that even further. Like, it's this is where you need her mathematical side of the solution, right? Yeah, for sure.
This is where you need to actually talk about.
But in the physical realm, you don't actually need this idea of like a Planck length, or like the smallest possible length, because I think I've heard of it in physics.
Yeah,
like
you don't.
length.
Yeah, they bring this up, this idea of there being a Planck length, or like like indivisible units of length in order to solve this problem. But you don't. Yeah, you're right. You don't need that. And the idea, and like, once you realize that division is something that we do as a process of measurement, then you can say, okay, well, if space is discrete, if spatial relationships are discrete, then obviously you can't choose a division that's smaller than the Planck length, or whatever you want to call it, right? The smallest unit of distance. You can't choose a standard that's smaller than that. And so as a result, then the problem solves itself, because you just can't physically do it. And this is what Norman Wildberger wants to do. Or he just wants to get rid of the idea that you can even keep going. But we don't have the answer to this question. For all we know, space is continuous. Any particular spatial relationship can always be cut in half. You can always consider half of a spatial relationship. I don't see any reason why you couldn't just keep chopping it. But then you realize chopping or considering different parts is something we do as a process of measurement. And you will always have some length that you've chosen as your standard. You'll never be able to choose literally an infinitely small length as your standard.
For sure. Yeah. And I guess now, like, now that we've kind of resolved that perspective on it, we can move on to the mathematical abstraction, because in the abstract sense, you can divide. There's no limit. There's no actual limit abstractly to the amount that you can divide a certain distance, because when you form this concept of infinite divisibility, it comes from this sort of division, where it says that, okay, there must be some length, but it can be any length. There's no actual limit to that length, and it applies basically open-endedly to this sort of process, this concept of infinite divisibility. So in a mathematical sense, Achilles does have to complete an infinite number of divisions, because he has to complete basically as many, or he would have to complete an infinite number of divisions, because in this concept of an infinite sequence, he has to pass every single he has to get to that point in reality where, I'm losing my train of thought. He has to get to that point. He has to basically pass as many divisions as he has to pass, basically. I'm struggling to explain this, but I remember the specific quote. But I don't remember the specific quote. But basically, like, he would, in a mathematically abstract sense, have to complete an infinite number of divisions. But he can do that in a abstract mathematical sense, because all that it means to complete an infinite number of divisions means to basically, in reality, in each individual context, it means to complete as many divisions as is required before it becomes perceptually indistinguishable from the previous.
Right, but now you're going back to the idea that when you say that, you're going back to the idea of our measurement process having a particular identity and cutting off at a particular point. Like let's say Achilles had to run the square root of 2 miles. Okay, so he runs 1 mile, and you're like, hey, you still got a little left. All right, I'll run 0.4 miles. All right, you still got a little left. All right, I'll run 1/100th of a mile. You still got a little left. Okay, I'll run 2/1000ths of a mile. 1.4, 1, 2. He's going through all the different decimal places of the square root of 2. Like, at some point, based on your measurement apparatus, the distance that he's run is indistinguishable from the square root of 2 miles.
Yeah.
Or, well, hold on. Yeah, or his measurement, your measurement apparatus, according to your measurement apparatus, at some point Achilles has run further than the square root of 2 miles, because you'll reach some decimal on some part of the decimal expansion. Achilles' distance will be measured as being larger then the decimal expansion brought out to like, let's say 4 decimal places. It's like I need to like write up what it is I'm trying to say here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, but like mathematically, there's no set limit on what that can be. Like when you form that concept, there is no specific limit on what it can be.
Yeah, in the realm of mathematics, you can make as many divisions as you want, but you'll only ever make
in reality
number of divisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in reality, you do that. Yeah, that's definitely
in the case. Reality. Well, I mean, yeah, whenever you're actually applying the number, say when you're applying the square root of 2, you're always going to apply a certain number of divisions, also known as you're only going to use a certain number of decimal places.
Yeah, but then mathematics. But when you form this mathematical concept of division, it has to apply to every single case of when you would need to divide something. So you would ultimately, it ultimately is this sort of concept of infinite divisibility, because you sort of because you have to make it so that there's no specific limit to that is enforced by the mathematics, so that it applies to every single situation regardless of what that limit is.
It's almost like I don't like the word infinity, because it's too tied up with other things, especially when you don't have to use that word. You can just say the mathematics gives us an open-ended procedure for finding any level of accuracy you desire. Or you can say the square root of 2, its decimal expansion goes on forever, because the square root of 2, like as a concept, its accuracy is one of the omitted measurements of the concept, as you said. Like, the measurement accuracy is an omitted measurement. So the decimal expansion can be brought out as many to some extent, but to any extent.
Yeah, and I mean that's where the concept of infinity can be valid, though. Like that's where we can, because that's sort of how Pat Corvini defines infinity. Like there's this lack of limit to the amount of divisions that we can make, and that's how she that's how she resolves the paradox from a mathematical sense, where she accepts the first premise but rejects the second, where she says that Achilles can make or has to make an infinite number of steps. He has to take an infinite number of steps here. But he can do that, because all that it means for him to have to take an infinite number of steps would mean that he has to take as many steps as is required for the distance between the two to be indistinguishable. Well, he can do that in any given case. So mathematically, when you form this concept, we realize that, okay, he has to make these infinite number of steps, but he can do that in any single given case. So when you form the concept, he can make an infinite number of steps in a abstract mathematical sense.
I see what you're saying. I mean, in this case, he's not actually taking the steps, though. Like, it's just that I see what you're saying. I don't know if I agree, though. Does she say that? I think remember.
This is essentially what I remember her argument to be.
Okay. Huh. So, yeah, that's because
cool. I mean that's how she defines the concept of infinity. It's simply this open-ended sort of application to each physical concept, where it's this sort of concept formed from each individual instance, where you omit the measurements of the measurements, where you omit the specific limits.
Yeah. Harry I remember Harry Benswanger does not use the word infinity. He does not like actually using that word. I mean, we don't need that word, but in the actual like mathematical sense, it can be like, that's how, like, if we want to say, like, okay, when we're taking like an infinite sum of something, like let's say it's the infinite sum, the convergent series of 1/2 to the power of n, where n goes from 0 to right. Let's say you're adding let's say you're adding 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16, etc.
Yeah, and then we realize that ultimately is going to equal 1, but because in each
does it ultimately equal 1? There is no ultimately.
Or I mean, like that's just the word that I use.
Well, yeah, but this is kind of my point. Like, is there any sense in which maybe even though I have Corvini's solution, I'm not actually like applying it. You see, to me, like, no, you never reach 1.
But
there comes a point at which when you apply this series, you're so close to one that your measurement apparatus can't tell the difference physically when you're applying the series in a physical situation. You reach a point at which the series is indistinguishable from one based on your current measurement apparatuses. But qua the series itself,
but math is the science of measurement, though. That's what you're doing with mathematics. So, and that what infinity means in this context is just as many as you need to do to get to that point where it's indistinguishable from what it converges to. So you'd make as many additions as you need to reach that, but there's no specific number in any given context.
Yeah, right. So it never reaches one.
But it does, though.
No, but it does in the mathematical sense. I think I see what you're saying. Like it is equal to one in the mathematical sense. The series is equal to one. Just like if you were to produce a series, representation of the square root of 2, like that equals the square root of 2.
Yep.
Like that equals is not, it seems like it's a different concept than equals, though.
What do you mean?
It is the square root of 2 because that's
think about in the context of
2 is a procedure that approximates is a procedure for approximating a relationship to any desired like degree of accuracy. That to me, that's what the square root, like that's the way I think of it. The square root of 2 is a measurement procedure for capturing a relationship between two quantities. That's what the square root of 2 is, as far as I'm concerned. So like when you say, and we have a series of approximation for the square root of 2. It's a certain rule for generating numbers that get you closer and closer.
Yeah, but then we do say that ultimately equals it. I mean, think back to mathematics is about the world. Do you know from Robert Knapp's that whole example of the triangles where it's like, oh, you see eventually as you get more and more precise that there's that extra side, which I didn't notice in my video when I recorded my triangle video.
Because you were too busy with librarian madness because you're just oh my God, this is so funny, or bigger. I keep making I've watched that video of yours like 6 times.
Yeah, but then
make it bigger.
Yeah. Oh man. But like.
Yeah.
Maybe the idea of equals doesn't actually apply in this context, but we say that is like a triangle, like it equals a shit. What's a better example? Like let's say I'm trying to think of an example that he used in the book.
Within a certain measurement standard, it's a triangle.
Yeah, and it is a triangle. Like it actually is a triangle.
Let's tell the audience what the hell we're talking about. So, in Robert Knapp's book. In Robert Knapp's book, he shows you a triangle. There it is. And there's the book. Mathematics is about the world.
Where's the triangle?
You can even find this page. It's not too hard because there's just a giant scary triangle. Yeah, show him the scary triangle.
That's not a triangle, though.
Little triangle, and he says, hey, is that a triangle? But then he zooms in, and you can see on camera that there's this tiny little edge that's been chopped off that actually makes this a quadrilateral technically.
Yeah.
And so you can make the argument like, okay, well, it was never a triangle to begin with. And this is the sort of thing that has caused people like Plato to say, oh, well, the real world doesn't have any triangles in it. Mm-hmm. So there must be some kind of mystical triangle out in the world of the forms. But Knapp is saying, well, no, the triangle is how does he say this? The triangle is a concept which is defined in a certain way, and certain objects, when measured within a certain measurement limitations, are triangles, including this one when you make it small enough. But then when we make it bigger, you can clearly see with your eyeballs that it's not a triangle, but it depends on your measurements, your standard of measurement.
Mm-hmm. And it's the same principle applies with basically all sort of like all these irrational numbers, even with the square root of 2. Like that, like it actually is a triangle. Like the smaller one, that's actually is a triangle, and we can refer to it as a triangle
within certain measurement parameters. Within the measurement parameters of your eyeballs, you can't tell.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of thing with this.
Although when I first read this, I looked at the small triangle and put my eyeball real close, and I could tell it wasn't a triangle, even on the printed.
You can.
Anyway.
I mean, technically, you can sort of see that with any triangle because there's going to be a point where those two atoms are going to be like,
or two dots of ink. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So the idea is here's, you can see that this is a quadrilateral, but then like if you make it smaller, you can't, it looks like a triangle now. So within that range of measurements, it's indistinguishable from a triangle. And therefore within, for whatever purpose you're using it for, it is a triangle. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's just a geometric version of what we're talking about when we talk about these infinite decimal expansions for something like the square root of 2. So the square root of 2 exists in that it's a way, it's a standard for relating measurements. And so does a triangle. It exists as an abstraction in order to relate measurements. And in certain contexts, you know, different amounts of precision are required. And so the concept of the triangle and the concept of the square root of 2 give you the procedure for dealing with any level of measurement accuracy.
Yep. Absolutely. And the mathematical concept is it has this accuracy, or it takes this accuracy and makes it open-ended, basically. It omits that measurement of precision.
Yeah. I think a huge part of this, like I think 90% of this battle is remembering that mathematics is about measurement.
Yep.
A lot of people will say like, oh, well, mathematics refers to reality. And that's true.
Yep.
But how does it refer to reality? Are the numbers actually out there, like in existence, like floating around? Like, is the gravitational field actually a number floating around in space that tells you like, thou shalt have this much acceleration at when you were at this location? Yeah, like it's not there. The number isn't out there. It's that we measure these things. All that's out there are things, and we compare some things against other things, and that's called a measurement. And we put a number on that comparison. So that's like numbers aren't in reality. They are our means of comparing things in reality. And if you just remember that, so much of this mathematical Platonism just drops away.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I'm trying to think about how we're going to connect this back to the paradox, but I think we've essentially like covered most of what it is that we have to resolve in that, because we mentioned the physical example. In every physical example, there's going to be a limit, and like there becomes a point where the points are indistinguishable. And the mathematical abstraction, there's this idea that there's no specific limit, and this idea of infinity here is basically saying that there's no specific limit, but it has to be some limit somewhere. And to make an infinite number of divisions and to cross those infinite number of divisions basically means that you have to make as many divisions as is required and cross as many divisions as is required by your individual context. And that's what it means to make an infinite number of divisions and to cross those infinite number of divisions. Now, there's no specific number of divisions that you have to cross. There's no specific number of divisions that you can make. But in every single context, you will be able to make a certain number of divisions. There will be some limit, and you will be able to cross that number of divisions. And that solves Zeno's paradox.
I don't know. I think you may have verbally slipped in there somewhere. Most of that sounded right, though.
It's possible. I hope I didn't. Now I'm trying to think if I did.
You said that we can cross an infinite number of divisions.
Yeah, in Corvini's definition of infinity, you can. In the mathematical abstract sense, not in the physical world. When you think about infinity as this open-ended concept referring an infinite number of divisions as an open-ended concept referring to the fact that in any specific case there's no specific limit to the number of divisions you can make. In that sense, it is unlimited, infinite. That's where you get that. That's how she defines the concept of infinity.
You're not crossing the divisions though. Like the divisions exist as as an unlimited potentiality in your measurement process. You're not crossing the divisions. You're not crossing.
They exist as a potentiality, as an abstract mathematical potentiality. And this is actually how Aristotle defined infinity, he defined it as like a pure potential, and that like she actually mentioned this at the beginning of one of her lectures. Pat Corvini did, and he said that infinity is a potential, but we're not exactly sure what that means because he didn't elaborate much on it. But I think this might be what he means, this sort of idea that there is this potential to make more divisions, but it's not an actual thing. So Aristotle seemed to get infinity right in this context.
Yeah. The way I would connect these two things, and this sort of sheds light on Corvini's solution, is that Zeno is mixing up the metaphysical and it's actually Zeno who's mixing up the metaphysical and the epistemological. The divisions only exist. All that exists are distances. The divisions only exist so far as we divide them, only so far as we take a given distance and we say, hey, how many of those distances do you need to line up to make the other distance? That's the only sense in which the divisions exist. And divisions will always exist in some finite number. They can exist in any number, but they exist in a finite number. But if you think that this process of division exists in the world, then you'll say, how does Achilles cross an infinite number of distances? That's wacky. Like that, It can't be the case. But he doesn't have to. This is why I'm insistent that he doesn't cross the distances, or that he doesn't cross the divisions. Because the divisions are something we do. It's not something Achilles crosses. He crosses the distance. He doesn't cross the distance. He crosses a distance, and then we make divisions in order to understand how far he went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like we have the potential here to make an infinite number, like not like abstractly with Corvini's specific definition of infinity. We have the potential to make any amount of divisions in an unlimited sense. There's no specific limit, and in each possible sense, every time that we do that, Achilles will cross those divisions in every single one. So that's the sense in which Achilles does cross an infinite number of divisions in the pure abstract conceptual sense. That's
he crosses a distance which could potentially be divided as many times as you'd like.
Yep. And in the mathematical sense, that's what Corvini refers to as an infinite number of divisions.
I'm not sure if I'm on board with you, but I'm also not interested in nitpicking that any further.
I mean, we can apply this to
we agree on
we can apply this concept of infinity. We could apply this concept of infinity to other like situations of infinity. Like think about the counting numbers, for example. You can like keep going up one for every single counting number. And so we say there's an infinite number of counting numbers. Now, in each individual context, there's going to be some limit to the amount of numbers that you can count. Like there's a certain limit to the amount of sheets of paper in the world, or amount of places you can write the numbers in the world. However, there's no specific limit. There's no specific limit in any given instance. So in that sense, we say the amount of counting numbers is infinite, and this is like the same definitions of infinity here.
I see. The reason you're adamant about this is you want to make sure there's room for the concept of infinity because you think it really does refer to something. It refers to this property of our measurement methods.
Yeah, the fact that conceptually, like there's when we abstract away, there is no specific limit, and like it's the abstraction is unlimited. It's infinite. That's what I mean. Yeah,
I understand. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if I agree, but that definitely makes sense. On your argument sounds good to me.
Yeah, there. I think this is essentially what Corvini's argument was, though. When from my understanding of it.
Okay. I don't remember that part. So yeah, and I know that Binswanger, I remember at one point Binswanger arguing against the use of the word infinity, and I remember being convinced. So that's why I don't remember exactly what it was, though.
I may need to read the Binswanger stuff then, because that could be interesting.
I'll give one more.
I know Binswanger makes some like really good arguments about infinity, and I've read certain things that he's written. Like I know Puya sent me stuff before about like Binswanger and infinity, because I've talked to him about mathematics before. And so I know Binswanger says good stuff, but he seems to be, like, when he talks about infinity, he seems to be saying that there is a limit in every particular instance. So we can't say infinity, we can't say something is infinite in the physical world. But I guess my argument would be that there is, like, in the conceptual sense, there is no particular limit. It's unlimited in that sense.
Okay. Let me write something down.
For sure. And then ultimately the Pat Corvini's kind of like final wrap up for this paradox. She goes into a lot more after that, because she kind of applies these principles just to mathematics in general in her third lecture. But her ultimate like conclusion is that Zeno's paradox conflates the abstract with the concrete. She basically explains that to accept the premises as true here, like, you have to be able to first say, like, okay, for the first premise, Achilles must complete an infinite number of divisions. Okay, this is true in the mathematical abstract sense, in the way that I've defined infinity here, or in the way that we have formed a proper concept of infinity here. Achilles does have to do that, and that's in the abstract sense. So you look at this problem initially as this abstract problem, but then you take it down. In the second premise, you take it down to an individual concrete. So you go from this broad abstraction and accept a premise as true in that broad abstract sense, down to a concrete in the second one. And you're saying, okay, Achilles can't complete an infinite number of divisions. So then in this, you have to like smuggle in the fact that, okay, this is a concrete race. And then conclusion, right, Achilles can't complete an infinite number of divisions. However, when you properly separate out the two and realize that the first premise, to accept it, you have to be referring to the abstract sense of infinity, and the second premise, you have to be referring to the concrete sense of infinity,
which doesn't exist, by the way. There is no concrete sense of infinity. I see. Okay, yeah, that's a good reason for keeping the word infinity, because infinity is a attribute of, like, infinity, when properly used, is an attribute of our measurement process, but not an attribute of the actual physical race. And so if you start mixing the two up, then you start getting some really funny looking stuff.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of reasons that I want to hold on to this concept of infinity. It's required very much for calculus. It's required for most of like most continuous forms of mathematics. We need this concept of infinity. So it's important that we can keep this concept of infinity, but we can't apply it into particular instances and assume that infinity is true in any given particular instance.
Yeah. So I was actually going to show an instance of calculus real quick to the audience. I'll screen share it to you so you can see what I'm saying. Let's see.
Hopefully it comes up in your window, because it might just like cover my whole screen. So we'll see.
Oh, you don't want it screen shared onto your side?
Oh, what's happening?
Am I screen sharing?
Yeah.
Can you see?
Yeah, it just looks really bad in my OBS. So maybe I'll I'll add a. Hold up, let me add a.
This may be more trouble than it's worth.
Display capture.
I'll Google the picture while you do this.
Full screen. Okay, there we go.
Let's see.
Yeah, let's do this. Okay, so now they see my full screen. Dope. All right, there we go.
So, let's see. Is it even working? Okay, yeah. So, I'm showing you guys the method of exhaustion here. And this is a method of calculating the area of a circle. Hopefully no dirty pictures come up. All right. Yeah. No dirty math pictures, it turns out. I'm always worried when I show my screen.
Isn't this how Archimedes figured out the area of a circle? Or is this not the case? Did
Archimedes do this? Yeah, it may have been Archimedes.
Because I just read something about the method of exhaustion in Archimedes somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't think I read it in any objectivist sources, though. I think I was just looking at the history of math or something. And then I saw like, oh, he used this theory, this like method of exhaustion, which was like similar to modern day calculus to some extent.
Oh, it's absolutely similar to calculus. This is some, I mean, Corvini talks about these methods in her other lectures. So when you get to those, you'll be able to see its similarity to calculus. So what I guess Archimedes, what he does is he takes a square, then he considers an octagon, which is inscribed within this circle. Then he considers a 16agon. Then from there, he might consider, a 32agon. And you can see that each time he increases the number of sides for this regular polygon, he's getting closer and closer to the actual area of the circle. And so you can approximate the size of the circle or the area of the circle by taking these smaller and smaller polygons. But what the Greeks did is they actually said, okay, wait a second. Or what Archimedes did, whoever came up with the method of exhaustion, what he did is he said, wait a second. As the number of sides gets larger and larger, does it actually get closer and closer to the area of the circle, or does it converge upon some other area? And he makes a certain kind of argument, a sort of indirect proof that yes, in fact, it does exactly equal the area as you go to an infinite number of terms. But this is again really interesting towards your point, Garrett, which is I'm going to stop screen sharing. We don't need to keep looking at this.
Sure. Hold up, let me fix my camera quick.
What's interesting is that
there we go.
Like, at no point do you actually have a circle. You'll always have some polygon with some certain number of sides. But the question is this a valid method at each individual measurement accuracy for approximating a circle? And the only way you can do that is by asking, does it equal a circle when you have an infinite number of sides? And like, as the number of sides gets larger and larger, does it keep getting close? Does it in fact keep getting closer and closer to the size of the circle? You have to prove that in order to show that this is a valid method of measurement. And that's why you need to, I guess this might be why you need, I'm not convinced yet, but this is really strong argument that you need the concept of infinity here. You actually need to say, okay, will this work for any will this work for any number of polygon sides, no matter how big it gets? Will it keep actually getting closer? So that's why we need the idea, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one thing that I like. This is one thing where I think limits are absolutely genius, because it, like, the use of limits actually preserves, in a sense, this definition of infinity, because it basically says you're getting closer and closer to this point where it's indistinguishable, basically. And once you reach that point in any given concrete instance, it is indistinguishable from infinity, or indistinguishable from, or as high as you can possibly go, basically. Or in a specific infinite division, it's as far divided as possible where you can't tell the difference between the two. But you can do that for basically any possible distinguishability limit.
And a limit does that, huh?
That seems to be like how the definition of limit works, from my understanding. That's sort of how I'm conceptualizing.
You're thinking of the Epsilon-Delta definition?
I'm not sure. I don't know what the. I just know the idea of just making a number smaller and smaller and getting it closer to a certain number.
I see. Oh, okay. Because I actually am playing with an idea of formulating calculus without limits. With like using this idea of, like, remember, like, it's some standard of measurement. Like, using this standard of measurement instead of thinking about a limit. But I kind of wonder if the Epsilon-Delta definition of a limit actually captures that or not.
Yeah, what's the Epsilon-Delta definition of a limit?
I'm not sure how to, like, explain it quickly. It's very technical, but basically it's a very rigorous way of explaining what we mean by x approaches zero. Like, what does it mean to approach zero? Like, with a limit, you're saying, as this as the independent variable of a function approaches h,
Yeah.
or I don't know, how do they say, as the independent variable of a function approaches a number, the value of the function approaches the limit. Well, what does it mean to approach?
Yeah.
And so
I guess
up with this rigorous definition.
I guess my like sort of initial thought in a good way to sort of define this would be is basically like some sequence that like gets closer and closer to the certain number and gets to a point in every instance where it's indistinguishable from it in every particular instance. However, there's no specific defined number of divisions that one would have to make. I guess that's how I conceptualize a limit, where you have to come up with some sequence.
Okay, well, that sounds pretty damn good. That sounds like kind of new, in fact. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it that way.
Did I just come up with a revolutionary mathematical idea?
Maybe.
I don't think I did. I think it's all based on Corvini.
But that's something to keep in your head right there, because it's applying this idea of some but any, and then applying it to calculus to make the concept of approach really clear. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know that in like calculus 1 classes, when they're defining limit for the first time, it's always like they start with like what is the value of the function at 1, and then at 0.1, and then at 0.01, and then like you do that on both sides of it, and then you get to this point where it's like, oh, this eventually is just completely indistinguishable from, these are like indistinguishable from each other on both sides, and we say that's what it converges to.
Well, they don't use the standard of indistinguishability because they're not thinking about actual. I guarantee you, no calculus book is actually what they're saying measurements. I'm saying that's you adding the last step. You're saying at any interval, as you get closer, at any interval, does that at every interval is the value of the function indistinguishable from the limit at smaller and smaller measurement granularities? Maybe is how you'd apply that.
Yeah. It'd be something along. I feel like, I don't know. It feels like it's just like an obvious extrapolation from Corvini's lectures, along with like how they initially teach limits, because that's kind of how I remember learning limits, and this sort of idea of like, oh, there's this function where it's just going like getting smaller by 1/10 each time, and it sort of becomes a sequence, and then you just like calculate that value and see what it approaches, and like it eventually obviously gets to an indistinguishable point where it equals that limit.
Right. Well, I mean, you can say that, but do you know what you call an obvious extrapolation from a completely revolutionary idea when well understood? That's called a discovery. What?
Rationalism.
No, I mean, I said properly understood. Like, that's called a discovery.
Yeah, that's true.
Once you reach a certain level, if you extrapolate from what you know, you'll discover something. At least that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that's, well, I know that's true. I'm not just hoping for it.
Yeah, man. Maybe
it's just a matter of getting there.
Maybe one day I'll be the next Robert Knapp or Pat Corvini, writing a whole book about math. That's actually one thing that I think about doing someday. Like once I have a better grasp of mathematical concepts, I can just like go in and like fully like flesh out this whole concept of like infinity, or just apply like Rand's theory of concepts to different mathematical things, which that seems like a really fun endeavor. Yeah, there's a lot to be done. These ideas Rand gave us just blew the lid off of tons of mysteries, and we're going to be working. We don't have enough people. I don't know. What the hell am I talking about when I say we? There's a lot of
new stuff to be learned applying these ideas. And I think these books are a real inspiration. They show you what's possible. Like all this stuff that was considered just unsolvable is just boom. Okay, now that we know that concepts are about measurement omission, or at least like specifically that mathematics and numbers refer to measurement, boom, it's like all of this complicated crap with Zeno and it's like, oh, well, you're just mixing up the metaphysical and the epistemological. I mean, I'm making it sound easy. It's hard to extrapolate from Rand.
It's very easy. Extremely easy.
It's super easy. Anyone can do it.
Anybody can do it. It doesn't take a genius.
Everyone, I don't think it takes a genius. I do think anyone can do it with enough effort. The question,
sure, but it would take like a genius stroke
to be clear. What's that?
It takes like a genius sort of integration, like Rand's theory of concepts. Like not everybody's going to come up with Rand's theory of concepts. I'm sure anybody technically could, but it takes like a genius amount of effort and a genius discovery in that sense. Because like Kant put in a lot of effort, but he didn't come up with Rand's theory of concepts.
He put in a lot of something, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you that. Yeah. I'm just trying to avoid, this view that we're starting to see that only geniuses can contribute to philosophy or something like that, or only geniuses can understand philosophy, or that seems to be some of the implications of some of these things that we've been arguing over in our little community.
I mean, I don't think it's entirely wrong, but I don't want to get too deep into that specific rabbit hole.
We don't have to discuss that. That's quite far afield. So
yeah, for sure.
But
I think we covered a lot.
We already did cover quite a lot. This might be a good time to end it here. So
we got a 2-hour video going very in depth. I think that was good. I'm glad we got into all of that stuff, and we covered most of what I think we initially wanted to cover anyways, didn't we?
Yeah, we covered everything. This is pretty much all I'm comfortable saying on this stuff. This, mathematics is not my primary area of study. I did
for sure
think about this stuff a lot at one point, but this is the kind of thing I'm hesitant to put out work on. Like, I guess I'd tell my viewers like this. I mean, I'll tell your viewers too. Like, this is what I've said today is not kind of my official canon. This is me just sort of having a conversation about a very important work, which is
for sure.
Which is, Mathematics is About the World by Knapp, and then Pat Corvini's body of work. So
yeah, for sure. Oh yeah, for sure. Like we're still learning this stuff. There's still a lot to be learned, I'd say, and a lot more to be thought about on these particular topics. And I'm certain that I'm going to look back on this in a few years and like be like, holy shit, like this, you said this specific word here when you should have used this word. I'm probably going to stand by everything I say. I think the principles that I'm grasping for are true. But yeah, I mean, there's still a lot to be learned and still a lot more reality to discover, because reality is pretty big.
Turns out it is. Yeah. Turns out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
That's it for me. Thanks for having me on your show, Garrett.
Yeah, for sure, man. Thanks for coming on. So
cool.
With that, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.